Hello everyone and welcome to another video. In today's video I thought I would talk to you about Stephen King. As you know, if you have watched my previous videos where I've talked about books, or if you follow me on Instagram, I'm a big reader. I love to read, and Stephen King is one of my top authors. But what you may also know, if you follow my Instagram or if you have watched some of my previous videos, is I have issues with lots of things in stories, issues with the way that things are written. I'm very sensitive, I'm autistic, and I'm very sensitive to the deliverance of information a lot of the time, and that is no different when I talk about Stephen King. So Stephen King is an author that I started reading in high school. I briefly went to sixth form, and when I say briefly, I mean really briefly. So sixth form, for those of you who don't know, is from the ages of 16 to 18 in the UK. You can leave high school. When I was at school, you could leave high school at the age of 16. You could go to college if you wanted to. Just realised I'm not wearing my glasses. I took them off to do an outfit photo for my Instagram, and I didn't put my glasses back on. I take them off when I do outfits because otherwise you can see, I've got a studio light and you can see the reflection. My friend at the time, Sabrina, I think this would have been when I first, because I associate Stephen King with a girl that I went to school with called Sabrina, and so I assume that this is the time. I can't specifically remember exactly when, but I think it would have been around that time. And I remember seeing that she was reading a Stephen King book, and I don't remember which book it was, but I remember seeing that she was reading a Stephen King book and thinking, oh, I've heard of Stephen King, I like to read, I'm going to try a Stephen King book. And the first Stephen King book that I ever read, as far as my memory serves, is the book Misery, and I was obsessed with the book Misery. I loved it. I carried it around with me for probably 3 months in my handbag. I used to do this with books. I would read a book and I would get that, you know, grief feeling for the fact that the book is over, almost like a book hangover. I would get that grief for the fact that the book is over and therefore the world has come to a close. These characters no longer have anything else to give me, and I wasn't ready to part with it. So I carried the book Misery around for a ridiculous amount of time just so it was close to me, because I absolutely loved it. And that was my introduction into the world of Stephen King, and from that point on it just kind of exploded and I started reading more and more and more. I also got introduced to movies that were made based on Stephen King books. So being someone who liked horror movies and being someone who liked Stephen King, there was kind of a way for me to incorporate reading and watching movies, which are two of my big loves, together. And I also love to analyse things. So then I got to watch movies based on Stephen King and analyse them in comparison to the books just for funsies. And that was something I really, really liked doing. For the longest time, my favourite Stephen King book to movie duo was the book Christine and the movie Christine. And actually, where have I put it? It's down there, never mind. I have a movie poster for Christine as well. I absolutely loved both of them. Obviously they're different in the sense that a movie is taking from the original idea and basically creating something new. I did like them both. I preferred the book in the sense that, like with lots of books to movies, the book makes more sense. The movie has to sell. And so the movie is based on what's popular at the time, what actors are popular at the time, who's considered attractive at the time, you know, that type of thing. Whereas the book is free to be anything it wants to be. So one of my issues with the movie to book, spoiler alert, this is going to be riddled with spoilers, was that the main character, Arnie, in the book is supposed to be stereotypically, by society standards, of a teenage boy considered unattractive. In the movie, he was very attractive, and so when he has his glow up, which is something that happens, nothing really happened in the movie, so it wasn't really like a moment. A lot of the drama and suspense is removed from the book to the movie because of the small tweaks that were made and because of the limitations that they had based on, I suppose you could say, what Hollywood wants to see. Also, a large part of the book is from the perspective of Dennis, who is Arnie's best friend, and we get to see the story unfold through the eyes of teenagers, whereas in the movie we are the third person looking in, and Dennis is like a really small character. It was just very different, but both are very enjoyable. Another one that many of you will have heard of, and there is a new movie that I have not seen, is Salem's Lot. This was one that I really, really enjoyed. Again, spoilers, based on vampires. Salem is not Salem as in Salem, Massachusetts. It's short for Jerusalem, and they call it Salem. So Salem's Lot. It's interesting, an interesting take on monsters. I think I love the worlds that Stephen King is able to create. I love his take on so many things, like his perception of reality and of the reality he creates. Now, not all of his books, this is absolutely not all of his books at all, but so many of his books are based around the Maine area in the US. And so lots and lots of them have reference to different areas. So whereas this one is based in a place called Salem's Lot, Jerusalem's Lot, if we look at it, for example, this is based in Derry, and so I don't remember exactly which books mention which, but different books mention that they've had to drive through this town or drive through that town or whatever, which is fairly close to all the others, you know. So you have that overlap, which kind of, in books where there are supernatural monsters, creatures, aliens, different things happening, it's kind of nice to know that they're all existing in this area that's not that far off from one another, and it also kind of makes things feel more realistic when you're a character and they're like, oh, I'm just driving through Derry, in a completely different book to it, and there's me thinking, oh, I wonder if this was during the time that Pennywise was sleeping for 27 years. Like, you know, it allows it, even though it's only like a subtle nod and it's a, you know, just a casual little mention, it allows the excitement of a previous world that you've stepped in, for me at least, of Stephen King's, to come back to life temporarily and kind of be given purpose. It is my absolute favourite all-time Stephen King book. I adore this book. I read this book years ago, and then I read it again last year. I think it was around October I read it. And when I say, no, it could have even been before, like September. When I say that I grieved for this book, I was hit so hard. Like, I fell into this book. I fell into this world. I fell head over heels. I was so obsessed when I was reading this. Even though I knew a lot of what was going to happen, I was so obsessed. It had been long enough that I'd forgotten lots of things, you know. And I've also seen the movie adaptation, the original one with Tim Curry, and I was just absolutely obsessed. And when it was over, I was heartbroken. I couldn't get over it. I talked to my friends about this for months afterwards. I decided, because I'd never seen it before, to watch the Bill Skarsgård versions, chapter 1 and chapter 2, because that is how the movies are done in chapter 1 and chapter 2. That is how the original one was done, but it was like a made for TV thing. And I decided to watch that because I thought maybe that will help. It didn't help. It made it worse. It made it so much worse. Then I decided to start like drawing it. One of my friends suggested to me, like, maybe, you know, get this out of your system, draw, because I draw. And I'm often doodling in my sketchbooks and stuff, and she was like, why don't you draw? So I did. Did it help? No. Maybe it helped, I don't know, but it was a really hard one to get over. A lot of people talk about it for the wrong reasons, I think. A lot of people assume that, and again, spoilers, all of my videos have spoilers, don't come here if you don't want spoilers. They assume that Pennywise is a evil clown because that is what we see in the imagery, and for some of the book he is, but Pennywise is not an evil clown. He can take the form of an evil clown, but he also takes the form of lots of other things. I really enjoyed the Bill Skarsgård movies as well. Bill Skarsgård playing the role of Pennywise. I don't really like, I don't want to compare the updated newer version to the previous version. They're different. There are, you know, some of them are, or I should say some things about them are better in the older ones in terms of more accurate to the book than the newer ones. Some things about the newer ones are more entertaining to watch, more fleshed out. I do have a very soft spot for stop motion, so for me, I really do like that part of the originals, that you know, that's how they created certain effects and things like that. But I don't really, they're different enough that I don't feel they really need to be compared. I am perfectly happy enjoying both of them, and I do enjoy both of them. It's it's considered a controversial book because of one particular scene in the story that gets talked about a lot. And what I think I find frustrating the most about this is that it often gets talked about by people who haven't read the book. And it's often referred to as the child orgy scene, which that's not what it is. It's not a child, or like that's it. There is a scene in the book where the characters who are, I think they're like 11, do engage in sexual activity. However, it is not an orgy. Like, it makes it sound like they're at like a wild party. That's not what's happening. Do I think that scene is necessary? For me personally, no, I don't think that scene was necessary. I'm not, although I like very much the works, the worlds, the creations of Stephen King, I'm really not a fan of how Stephen King talks about sex. Now, in general, when Stephen King does talk about sex, it makes me feel really uncomfortable. I'm not a massive fan of sex scenes in books anyway, but when Stephen King talks about sex, it really feels like the classic example of a man writing sex, often from a female perspective, and it is just really cringy for me personally. I'm always like, oh god, here we go, and I just want to get through it. And so reading a sex scene from the perspective of a child who is female, it was just really unnecessary. I think he was trying to do something there that just did not come across, like that was supposed to be valuable, that was supposed to be important, that was supposed to be like a coming of age, like turning the page type of thing. It didn't work for me, and I do think the whole story would have just been better if it wasn't there. When I read the story, it's kind of just one of those things that I just pretend didn't happen. When I think about that story, it didn't happen in my mind. It was just completely unnecessary. I think it is important when we're reading books that were not written today, that we do take into consideration that the perspective of things that were perhaps frowned upon, or that were perhaps judged differently to the way that they are today, is important to take into consideration. The language that is used, and often like the misogyny and the racism and the sexism that we see in books and stuff in general, of course those things are displayed in books throughout history. Of course they are. Like, there's no point in using the standards of today against things that were previously written when the standards were not what they are today. However, with this particular scene in this particular book, I don't feel it needed to be there. I find it really bizarre. I think it, you know, when this was taken to publishers and stuff, I find it strange that no one was like, you know, I find it strange no one pointed it out, or if it did get challenged, why not more so? I don't think it's a strong enough, necessary enough scene to bring something so unusual to take place. You know, it just wasn't. Yeah, that's my opinion basically. But like I said, in general, I do find Stephen King a very cringe sex scene writer, because there is men, or people in general, I should say, writing sex scenes from the perspective of a gender that they do not identify with, or from the anatomy that they do not have, and talking about psychologically what that's like, I find very strange. And if you are going to do that, obviously do your research. And it just feels like if there was research done, the people who were asked were perhaps not honest, because it just, yeah, it's something I find very strange and very cringy in his books, and I just kind of gloss over it. But yeah, I do think that it's a shame that that one scene in it is something that most people you speak to are like, oh, is that the book with the child orgy? And it's like, you know, that it's in one chapter towards the end of the book, and it's a very brief moment in the whole scheme of the world that's created, the story that's created, this journey that unfolds, that really didn't need to be there. And it seems to be the thing that most people remember, and it's just such a shame it's not in either of the movie adaptations, and nothing is missing. So, you know, the next one I want to talk to you about, actually I'm going to leave that one till last. The next one I want to talk to you about is The Shining. I personally really enjoy the movie The Shining. I am very, very sensitive to colour, and so the colour, the music, the pacing, I really like the movie. I love the casting choices, and I do feel, although just like with many, many Stephen King books, there is vast difference from the book to the movie, I do feel like the movie for me works. Do I prefer the book? Yes, I do, because you just get so much more information. The Shining for me is one of my favourites. Along with the rest of these that I'm showing you, I do have more Stephen King books. These are just the ones that I've selected. I've selected my favourites to show you so that I could talk about them, and then I've selected one that I detest that I'm going to show you. The Shining for me was one of my favourites. I love the fact, how can I say it? I love Stephen King writing books from the perspective of children. I love when he, even if it's not from the perspective of children, I love how he writes children. It does feel very authentic, and as an adult it is very enjoyable to read. Something I liked about this, although not a book from the perspective of the child, but what I really liked about The Shining is this is a very young boy in this story, and so for me, I suppose the best way that I can explain it is when I read a book, I put myself in the character's shoes as to how I would feel, and the isolation created in the book by the circumstances of this family going to this isolated hotel in the snow, you know, unable to to get anywhere, and people unable to get to them for such a long period of time. That's very kind of, you know, that in itself is creepy, right? Like, even if this family had a whale of a time whilst they were there, but the idea of having such a young boy who would deal with everything that happens in the book in a childlike way rather than just from the perspective of an adult, but the lack of understanding that would come with that based on the fact that he is a child and his parents are supposed to be able to take care of him. You know, I do think that something that the movie really is missing for me personally is the impact of the relationship between the main character and his wife and him and his son before they actually even get to the hotel, because that is something that is constantly reflected back on in the book, and I do think that that adds so much to how things unfurl in the story, and also why things are so eerie and so creepy even when not that much is going on. The scariest of the Stephen King books, in my personal opinion, and still one of my favourites, is Pet Sematary. When I read Pet Sematary, I was on the edge of my seat, and I don't get like that with, you know, I'm somebody that watches a lot of horror movies, I read a lot of horror books. I don't really have that edge of my seat jumpiness about me, not because like I'm so cool, but it's just not something, I don't normally get hit with that side of things. I think I like to see what happens. I like the curiosity of things. I don't really have that, I don't really experience a sense of fear when I'm reading or watching something. I feel I'm observing it, I'm not in it. Whereas with Pet Sematary, something about this one, right from the start, I was in it. You know, like I've said in the previous ones I've shared, I put myself in the character's position, but it's like a choice though. Like, I'm thinking, oh, how would I feel if this was happening to me? With Pet Sematary, I didn't have to do that. I didn't have to think, oh, how would I feel if that happened to me? Instantly, it was this fear. And as somebody that suffers from anxiety, I think that was why this one got me so much. For those of you who don't know, there is movies, if you haven't read the book, but if you haven't read the book and you haven't seen the movies, for those of you who don't know, spoiler alert, this is about a family who moves into a new house that is by a very big main road that has these huge lorries coming across very fast all the time. And they move into this house with a very young child, and just that alone, even without the rest of the story, just that alone, I don't have children, just that alone fills me with dread. The idea of being a parent to a child of any age, with your garden just literally ending, and then a main road with just fast lorry traffic coming across. Terrifying. As the story unfolds, it just gets scarier and scarier, because not only do terrible things happen, but then the parent, well, it's actually the father, has to take measures into his own hands to stop this story unfolding. And then as a result of that, basically anything where you have to kill your own children, horrific. Do you know what I mean? Like, just absolutely horrific. And I think for me, the suspense of anxiety, like being held in that state of anxiety of living with this big road and the risk of any of your family getting hurt, your pets getting hurt, because there is a cat called Church, getting hurt, and actually having to use that road, cross that road on a regular basis. And yeah, And then when something does happen, actually being like, oh shit, like I've got to take care of this myself. The idea of having, I think for me, the idea of having something happen where I have to essentially put down one of my loved ones, I can't even, I don't think I would be able to. I think I would just be like, do you know what, get me, it's fine. And the idea of that happening and the person that you have to end is your own child, terrifying, absolutely terrifying. I think that as a horror writer, Stephen King is just so creative. It's not a case of, oh, scary house ghosts, blah, 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 which is nothing wrong with. And I'm sure, you know, don't get me wrong, there are plenty of elements of that type of thing in his writing, but the way, it's the psychological element for me, you know, the way that he really thinks about, you can tell that this is written from the perspective of somebody that's thought about how terrifying this would be if it happened to him and to his family or to his friends or to his friendship group, or, you know, and yeah, it hits different to a fiction writer who is like, oh, you know, it would be cool. And it doesn't matter how well something is written, if you haven't put yourself in it, if it doesn't frighten you, it's not going to frighten other people, I think. Or that's how I feel anyway. Now, one Stephen King book that I just can't, and I find it funny, for those of you who don't know, I have a Goodreads account where I document everything that I'm reading, have read, and well, not document everything I've ever read ever, because I haven't always had a Goodreads account. I can't remember everything I've ever read ever. But I document the stuff that I'm reading, like, currently, and I rate it when I've finished, and, you know, sometimes I review them, sometimes I don't. This one has been on my list now of currently reading forever because I haven't finished it, and I don't want to, but I also don't want to take it off my list. It's The Tommyknockers. I really thought I was gonna like this story until I read it, and I don't. Really don't. And the longer I leave it without, I have a real problem with starting books and not finishing them, as in, I don't like doing it. It makes me feel icky when I do that. I know lots of people do it. I'm not saying you shouldn't. I really struggle. Just like if I read the first book in a series of books, I feel like I have to read the rest, even if I didn't like it. It's just how my brain works. And I hate with a passion that I have not finished this book. I will at some point force myself to read this book. I don't like it. Not because it's scary, because I am totally uninvested in all of the characters and in the story. I don't care. I don't like it. And the longer I leave it, like, it's probably been well over 6 months now, the longer I leave it, the worse it gets, because I'm forgetting about it, which means when I eventually manage to force myself to go back and read it, I'm gonna have to go even further back to read, like, or do some form of research to remind me what was in the first bit that I read. I mean, I'm over halfway through, but I just can't. Do you know what I mean? I can't do it. Every time I see the book, I'm like, oh no. I'm angry that it exists in my home, and I'm angry that I started reading it. I don't want to ever have to finish it, but I will at some point. But yeah, I thought that would be interesting to share my love of Stephen King. I thought I would talk to you about when I started reading Stephen King. I thought I would talk to you a little bit about books versus movies, although I do see them as separate entities. And I wanted to share some of my favourites with you. Like I said, I do have others. I got Stephen King books that I've never read yet, like ones that I found in charity shops and stuff, and I'm like, oh, I'll take that home, because when I find it and it's a good price, I'm going to take it home. So it's not like I've read every Stephen King book ever, far from it. But I do very much appreciate Stephen King overall. Like I said, there are certain aspects of his writing that I do not appreciate, and that would be the sex scenes. I'm not a massive fan of sex scenes in general, but I do think there is a way that I find less revolting and a way, you know, like less cringe, less revolting, and the way that he does it is really not for me. So yeah, and also I would say as well, like I briefly mentioned in the video, these are not new books. He is not a writer. Like most of his writing is fairly old. I mean, it's bizarre to say that now, but it is fairly old compared to a lot of the books that we see going around now when people are talking about them on YouTube or TikTok or Instagram or whatever. So you kind of have to go into, if you're going to read a book that is not a modern day book, like I said, there is no point going into it with the standards of the language and perception of what we deem to be acceptable now, and then being shocked that someone's being racist or, you know, extremely sexist, misogynistic, or like classist or anything like that. It's there because it was there in real life. And I think, if anything, although, you know, when I read those things, a lot of the time it makes my eyebrows raise, I think actually reading those things is a nice wake-up call in terms of how lucky we are today. Not saying that everything's fine, very far from it, but it just goes to show us how far we have come with lots of these issues. And so yeah, if you're somebody that hasn't read Stephen King and you're like, oh, I've always wanted to read Stephen King, I think I'll read Stephen King, do not be I can't think of the word. Do not be fooled. You're going to read sexist, misogynistic things. You're going to read racist characters. You're going to read racist language. You're going to read things that you don't necessarily enjoy hearing, because that is what was happening at the time that these stories are based on. So yeah, I think that's important to take into consideration. So I hope that you enjoyed my video, and I'll speak to you guys soon. Bye for now.